How did a routine cargo fire in a Texas port escalate into one of the deadliest industrial explosions in American history, despite the presence of experienced crews and emergency responders? On April 16, 1947, over 2,000 tons of ammonium nitrate detonated aboard a single ship docked at the Texas City waterfront at 9:12 in the morning, killing hundreds and leveling everything in its path. But the disaster did not begin with the blast. It began with a port that was never built to survive one. By the mid-1940s, Texas City had become a showcase for American industrial ambition. Along the Gulf Coast, a dense patchwork of oil refineries, chemical plants, and storage farms crowded the shoreline. In just a decade, wartime demand and post-war optimism had drawn millions of investment dollars into the port, transforming what was once a modest shipping outpost into a vital link in the global supply chain. The city's 11-mile waterfront bristled with infrastructure, refinery towers, pipelines, and sprawling tank fields pressed shoulder to shoulder with grain elevators and fertilizer warehouses. Sandborn fire insurance maps from the era charted a landscape where bulk chemical terminals and gasoline tanks sat within a few hundred feet of the main cargo piers. The Texas City Oil Refinery, the Gulf Oil Complex, and the Monsanto chemical plant operated in close quarters, their process units and storage tanks forming a continuous industrial corridor. By 1947, the port handled not just petroleum, but also wheat, coal, and a growing volume of synthetic fertilizers, cargoes that reflected the changing face of American agriculture and industry. The city's rapid expansion came with few restrictions. Zoning regulations were minimal, and the boundaries between residential neighborhoods and industrial zones blurred as the city grew. New refineries and chemical plants sprang up alongside older facilities, often separated by little more than a chain-link fence. Bulk storage tanks, some holding thousands of barrels of flammable liquids, stood in tight clusters, sometimes just a few yards from the docks where ships loaded and unloaded hazardous cargo. This compressed geography created a web of risk. The port's piers were designed for maximum throughput, not for isolation or blast protection. Vessels carrying volatile chemicals docked side by side, and rail lines snaked between refineries and warehouses, moving raw materials directly through the heart of the complex. Safety protocols lagged behind the pace of growth. Fire breaks were narrow, and emergency access routes were often blocked by parked tank cars or stacked cargo. During World War II, the city's industrial capacity more than doubled. The port shipped oil, aviation fuel, and fertilizer to support the war effort, pushing its infrastructure to the limit. After the war, production continued at a breakneck pace, with little time or incentive to revisit safety standards. By 1947, Texas City's docks and refineries operated at near full capacity, their proximity and interdependence creating a system where a single failure could ripple outward, affecting every link in the chain. The result was an industrial landscape primed for disaster. High-risk assets, chemical storage, fuel tanks, and bulk cargoes stood packed together in a confined space, separated by only the thinnest of barriers. The port's growth had outpaced its ability to manage the hazards it now contained, setting the stage for a catastrophe that would expose the limits of mid-century safety knowledge and the consequences of unchecked industrial expansion. Authority in Texas City's port was divided across a patchwork of agencies, each with its own mandate and blind spots. The Port Authority managed berth assignments and cargo schedules, but its regulations were written for throughput, not hazard control. City ordinances focused on ordinary fire risks, wooden warehouses, oil tanks, open flames on the docks, but made no mention of chemical oxidizers or bulk fertilizers. The Municipal Fire Code, last updated in 1941, outlined procedures for extinguishing warehouse and shipboard fires with water or foam, yet offered no guidance for substances like ammonium nitrate. Specialized hazardous material standards simply did not exist. Jurisdiction over safety was further muddied by overlapping responsibilities. The U.S. Coast Guard set rules for vessel construction and general shipboard safety, but its Marine Inspection Act, dating back to 1905, left cargo-specific risks largely unaddressed. The Coast Guard could inspect ships for seaworthiness and lifeboat drills, but had no statutory power to enforce chemical segregation or temperature monitoring for fertilizer cargoes. Meanwhile, the city fire department answered to municipal leadership, responding on land and at the piers, but held no authority over foreign-flagged vessels or their cargo holds. Private terminal operators who leased dock space and managed loading crews operated under a separate set of requirements dictated by insurance companies and commercial contracts. Their main concern was keeping goods moving and minimizing delays, not scrutinizing the chemical properties of every shipment. In practice, this meant that fertilizer sacks and barrels of oil could be stacked side by side with only a manifest and a handshake separating them. When emergencies arose, confusion was common. Radio networks were not standardized. The fire department, port authority, and ship's officers communicated on different frequencies, often relaying urgent messages through a dispatcher or even by runner. In the event of a fire, there was no clear protocol for who could overrule a captain's orders or how to coordinate between shore crews and ship's engineers. The absence of a unified command structure left responders improvising, with each agency acting according to its own playbook. Municipal guidelines of the 1940s reflected a world where industrial hazards were defined by flammable liquids and open flames, not by the potential for a chemical runaway in a sealed hold. There were no requirements for temperature sensors in fertilizer storage, no rules about venting, and no mandate to separate oxidizers from combustibles. The city's zoning laws allowed residential neighborhoods to creep up against refinery fences and bulk storage tanks to cluster within yards of the main docks. These invisible cracks in the system set the stage for disaster. The lack of specialized hazmat codes meant that standard firefighting tactics, water, foam, and steam, were applied to chemical cargoes with unknown properties. Overlapping jurisdictions created delays and confusion at the worst possible moment. In Texas City, routine operations were carried out in an environment where the scale of risk had quietly outgrown the rules meant to contain it. At first light on April 16, 1947, the steamship Grand Camp's deck bustled with stevedores moving sacks of ammonium nitrate into the forward hold. The morning routine was interrupted just before 8 in the morning, when a faint, acrid smell drifted from the open hatch. A dock worker paused, noticing a thin wisp of gray smoke curling upward from the darkness below. His call brought others to the rail. In the ship's log, the first written record of smoke appears at 8 in the morning, a detail later confirmed by Port Authority, radio logs, and the Coast Guard's investigation. The initial response was measured, almost casual. For men accustomed to the hazards of oil, grain dust, and hot machinery, a bit of smoke in a cargo hold was nothing new. Stevedores reached for buckets of water and sand, hoping to smother whatever smoldered below. The ammonium nitrate, packed in heavy paper sacks, was known as a fertilizer, not as a threat. Some men believed the fire would die out if left alone, while others worried about damaging valuable cargo. Within minutes, the smoke thickened and turned a deeper black. Witnesses later described a sulfurous odor and a subtle, persistent heat radiating from the hatch. By 8:05 in the morning, the ship's bosun had alerted the mate, and a runner was sent to the port office to request assistance. The ship's captain, Auguste Bouchard, arrived on deck and ordered the crew to keep the hatch closed as much as possible, hoping to starve the fire of oxygen. His decision reflected standard practice for grain fires, where sealing the hold could prevent a blaze from spreading. The Texas City Fire Department received the alarm at 8:07 in the morning. Fire Chief H. Brown dispatched Engine 1 to the pier, while dock workers continued to debate the best course of action. Some tried to tamp down the smoke with wet burlap sacks, others sprinkled sand into the hold. The ammonium nitrate began to cake and clump, absorbing moisture and forming a dense, sticky mass. Instead of smothering the heat, these efforts only increased the confusion. By the time firefighters arrived at 8:12 in the morning, the smoke had grown into a dense, oily plume. The stevedores, many of whom had worked Texas City's docks for years, stood back uneasy. Their faces reflected a dawning realization that this was no ordinary cargo fire. The routine had slipped into uncertainty, and the first warning signs had gone unheeded. Each action, from the first bucket of water to the decision to keep the hold sealed, would soon become part of a chain that no one on the pier could stop. Captain Auguste Bouchard stood on the deck of SS Grand Camp as smoke thickened over Hold 4. Standard practice for grain fires called for sealing the hold to starve the flames, but ammonium nitrate was not a familiar threat. Bouchard weighed the risk to his cargo and the pressure from dock workers anxious about fire spreading. At 8:15 in the morning, he issued a direct order: keep the hatch partially open, venting smoke, but do not close it completely. His reasoning echoed the logic of cargo preservation. Ventilation would limit damage and prevent a dangerous buildup of gases, or so he believed. On the pier, Fire Chief H. Brown arrived with Engine 1. He faced a dilemma familiar to first responders in the 1940s: act quickly, but defer to the ship's master. The city's fire code gave him authority on land, but not on a foreign-flagged vessel. Brown requested permission to seal the hold and cut off oxygen. The captain refused. Radio logs captured the exchange: request to seal hold, permission denied. Maintain ventilation. The chain of command was clear, but the science was not. Minutes ticked by as the fire deepened. With the hatch ajar, fresh air fed the smoldering cargo. The ammonium nitrate, already hot and caked from earlier firefighting attempts, began to decompose more rapidly. Dock workers and firefighters debated tactics, but the captain's word held. At 8:18, Bouchard ordered the ship's engineers to inject steam from the Grand Camp's boilers directly into the hold. This method, borrowed from grain and oil fires, was meant to smother flames and cool the space. Instead, it raised the temperature inside the sealed compartment, turning moisture into vapor and accelerating the chemical breakdown of the fertilizer. Chief Brown, recognizing the danger, pressed for withdrawal. He radioed the port authority: all fire units retreat, hazard too great. The order to abandon ship was given at 8:31 in the morning. Crew members scrambled for lifeboats while Brown's men pulled back to the dock. Yet even as the evacuation began, the captain kept the hold vented, hoping to prevent an explosion by allowing pressure to escape. The reality was more complex. The combination of heat, confinement, and fresh oxygen had set in motion a runaway reaction that no one fully understood. These decisions, ventilation over sealing, steam over dry agents, orders relayed through fragmented channels, were not reckless improvisations. They reflected the best knowledge and habits of experienced men facing an unfamiliar hazard. But each command, documented in radio transcripts and ship's logs, pushed the system closer to its breaking point. Human agency, not fate or bad luck, guided the response. The consequences of these choices would soon become irreversible. By 8:45 a.m., the situation on the Grand Camp's deck had shifted from confusion to open alarm. Firefighters and dock workers, faces streaked with sweat and ash, watched as the smoke from Hold 4 thickened into a swirling column that rose above the pier. The air vibrated with a low, unsettling rumble. Fire Chief H. Brown, standing at the edge of the dock, weighed his options. He had already given the order to withdraw his men, but the chain of command on the ship remained tangled. The captain, still hoping to save the vessel and its cargo, kept the hatch vented. Steam continued to pour into the hold, raising the temperature and pressure with every passing minute. The Coast Guard's incident clock captured the sequence with precision. At 9 a.m., emergency alarms echoed across the port, prompting city officials to order a full evacuation of the waterfront. Some workers ran for the open lots behind the warehouses. Others lingered, drawn by the spectacle or unwilling to abandon their posts. The evacuation was incomplete. A handful of firefighters, believing they could still hold the fire at bay, stayed near the ship's rail. Crew members scrambled to launch lifeboats, while dock supervisors shouted for everyone to clear the area. The sense of urgency was palpable, but the scale of the risk was not yet understood. Inside Hold 4, nearly 2,000 tons of ammonium nitrate fertilizer had been transformed by heat and confinement. The cargo, packed tightly in heavy paper sacks, had absorbed moisture and oil from the ship's stores. The steam, intended to suppress the fire, now accelerated the chemical reaction. Witnesses later described a series of muffled pops and a sudden flash of orange light from the open hatch. The temperature inside the hold soared past 300 degrees Celsius, driving pressure ever higher in the sealed space. At 9:10 a.m., a large fireball erupted from the hatch, sending a shock wave through the dockyards. The Coast Guard's radio logs recorded frantic calls for assistance, but the window for intervention had closed. 2 minutes later, the Grand Camp vanished in a blinding explosion. The blast, time-stamped at 9:12 a.m., obliterated the ship and sent debris raining over the port. The force of the detonation, fueled by the entire mass of ammonium nitrate, shattered windows miles away and ignited fires throughout the industrial district. 26 firefighters died instantly, along with dozens of dock workers and crew. The chain of decisions, venting the hatch, injecting steam, and a partial evacuation had reached its irreversible end. In less than 90 minutes, a manageable fire had become the deadliest port explosion in American history. Ammonium nitrate, the fertilizer packed into Grand Camp's holds, is a chemical with a split personality. Under normal conditions, it is stable enough to be shipped in bulk, but when exposed to heat, its behavior changes in ways that were poorly understood in 1947. At around 170 degrees Celsius, ammonium nitrate shifts from a solid to a viscous melt, a sticky slurry that clings to surfaces and seeps into every crevice. This phase change, invisible to the eye but critical to its chemistry, opens the door to new risks. As the temperature climbs, the melt becomes more reactive, especially if it mixes with stray hydrocarbons such as bunker oil, grease, or even bits of organic debris common in ship holds. In the Grand Camp, the cargo was stacked in heavy paper sacks, many already damp from Gulf Coast humidity and patched with oil meant to keep water out. Instead, the oil and moisture combined with the fertilizer, lowering the temperature at which it would start to break down. Laboratory tests and later forensic studies confirmed that even a thin film of oil could act as a fuel, creating a mixture with explosive potential far greater than pure ammonium nitrate alone. The presence of this contaminated melt meant that once the fire took hold, the cargo could no longer be treated as an inert pile of fertilizer. Instead, it behaved more like an industrial explosive, one that grew more sensitive to shock, heat, and pressure as the reaction advanced. The slurry trapped heat accelerated decomposition and began to generate gases that built up behind the sealed hatches. With each minute, the internal pressure rose and the risk of a runaway reaction increased. The stage was set for a chain of chemical events that no one on the dock fully understood and for which no standard firefighting method of the day could provide a safe answer. Dense packing and sealed compartments are not just background details, they are central to how a slow-burning fire can transform into a detonation. Inside the Grand Camp's hold, ammonium nitrate was stacked in heavy sacks, filling more than 90% of the available space. Each sack pressed tightly against its neighbors, leaving almost no room for air or heat to escape. This high degree of compaction, combined with the ship's closed ventilation system, created a chamber where pressure could rise unchecked. As the fire advanced, the temperature inside the hold climbed past 300 degrees Celsius. The ammonium nitrate, already contaminated with oil and moisture, began to decompose rapidly. This decomposition released gases, nitrogen oxides, steam, and oxygen that had nowhere to go. With the hatches sealed or only partially vented, those gases built up behind the steel walls, forcing the internal pressure higher with every passing minute. Pressure curves reconstructed from later laboratory tests show just how quickly this process accelerates. In a confined space, even a modest fire can drive pressures to several megapascals within minutes. The reaction front moves faster as the pressure increases, feeding on itself in a feedback loop. Once the hold's pressure exceeds a critical threshold, around 2 to 5 megapascals for ammonium nitrate mixed with oil, the nature of the reaction changes. What starts as a slow burn, or deflagration, can suddenly transition to a detonation, sending a shock wave through the entire cargo mass. This phenomenon, known as deflagration to detonation transition, depends on both the confinement of the space and the density of the material. Without sealed hatches and tightly packed cargo, the same fire might have fizzled or vented harmlessly. But inside the Grand Camp, every element, compaction, moisture, oil, and sealed steel, combine to create a pressure cooker. The pathway from routine fire to catastrophic blast runs straight through the physics of confinement, where pressure builds invisibly until the system can no longer contain it. Experimental reconstructions confirm that under these conditions, detonation is not just possible, it becomes almost inevitable. Modern science has left little doubt about the chemistry that doomed the Grand Camp. In the decades since 1947, forensic teams and chemical engineers reconstructed the disaster in laboratory settings, using physical experiments and advanced computer models. These studies show that ammonium nitrate, when heated above 170 degrees Celsius and confined in a sealed space, does not behave like a simple fertilizer. Instead, it becomes volatile, especially when contaminated with oil or organic debris, the very conditions found in the ship's hold that morning. In controlled experiments, researchers packed ammonium nitrate into steel vessels, mimicking the dense, nearly airtight cargo holds of mid-century freighters. By applying heat and restricting ventilation, they observed a rapid pressure buildup inside the test chambers. Within minutes, the temperature at the fire front soared past 300 degrees Celsius. Gas pressure spiked, sometimes reaching 4 to 5 megapascals, enough to rupture steel and trigger a transition from slow burning to full detonation. These results match the pressure curves and temperature gradients reconstructed from the Grand Camp's remains and from eyewitness reports of the fire's progression. Computational fluid dynamics models went further, simulating the exact geometry of the Grand Camp's cargo hold and the effect of steam injection on the reaction front. The models show that a combination of high compaction, oil contamination, and rapid heating can produce a runaway reaction in less than 2 minutes once the critical threshold is crossed. The detonation wave, once initiated, propagates through the entire mass almost instantaneously, explaining the scale and speed of the blast that destroyed the ship and much of the port. These findings have been corroborated by multiple independent teams, including U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, reconstructions, and university chemists using modern analytical tools. The scientific consensus is clear. The Grand Camp disaster was not a random accident, but the predictable outcome of specific physical and chemical conditions. The evidence leaves no room for doubt about the mechanism that turned a routine fire into a city-shattering explosion. The explosion aboard the Grand Camp sent a shockwave that radiated through the heart of Texas City's industrial corridor. In an instant, the force of the blast ruptured above-ground fuel lines, splitting open pipes that fed gasoline and crude oil to the refinery tanks clustered along the docks. Liquid hydrocarbons sprayed from broken joints, igniting as they hit the air. Flames leapt from the shattered pipe racks, racing along the catwalks and engulfing the first row of storage tanks. Warehouse roofs collapsed under the pressure, their wooden frames splintering as fire swept through stacks of chemicals and bagged fertilizer. Reports from the Port Authority described entire buildings consumed in seconds, with burning debris raining down on the tank farms and rail yards. The energy of the blast did not stop at the waterfront. Windows shattered in the Monsanto chemical plant, and workers scrambled to shut down process units as fires broke out in the adjacent warehouses. The city's firefighting crews, already reeling from the loss of their colleagues on the pier, were forced to retreat as walls of flame cut off access to the burning docks. Emergency radio traffic captured the chaos. Calls for more water pressure, for backup engines, for help evacuating trapped workers from the refinery's maze of pipes and catwalks. Fuel tanks nearest the blast site ruptured, spilling thousands of gallons of gasoline into the open ditches that crisscrossed the port. The liquid fire flowed downhill, setting alight stacks of lumber and barrels of lubricants stored in the open. The city's water mains, already compromised by the initial shock, buckled under the strain, leaving firefighters with little more than portable pumps and hand lines to battle the spreading inferno. Within minutes, the port's tightly packed infrastructure, fuel lines, chemical warehouses, and storage tanks had become a single, interconnected firestorm. The initial explosion was not an isolated event, but the trigger for a cascade of secondary fires that would burn uncontrolled for hours. Each new ignition point sent up its own column of black smoke, marking the relentless advance of destruction through the industrial heart of Texas City. The Grand Camp's explosion was not the end of the disaster, but the beginning of a second, hidden threat. Just a few hundred feet away, the SS High Flyer sat at anchor, its hull battered by flying debris. The shockwave from the first blast had torn open the ship's superstructure and scattered burning wreckage across its deck. Port Authority logs from April 16th detail the immediate aftermath. At 9:18 a.m., a crewman on the High Flyer reported that the hold was filling with smoke, and the vessel was taking on water. The High Flyer's cargo manifest listed more than 1,000 tons of ammonium nitrate and an equal quantity of sulfur, both stored below deck in tightly packed sacks. Initial efforts to control the fire on the High Flyer were hampered by the destruction of firefighting equipment and the chaos on the docks. With water mains ruptured and hoses shredded by shrapnel, responders could do little more than watch as flames crept through the ship's hold. Radio messages between the Port Authority and the Coast Guard captured the urgency. Fire was spreading on High Flyer. Ammonium nitrate was aboard. Immediate assistance was required. The logs also record a desperate attempt by tugboats to pull the burning ship away from the docks, but the mooring lines were jammed by twisted metal and debris from the Grand Camp's explosion. For hours, the High Flyer burned largely unattended. The fire smoldered deep within the cargo, hidden from view but steadily consuming the volatile mixture below deck. Investigators later found that debris from the Grand Camp had punctured the High Flyer's hull, allowing flames and hot fragments to ignite the ammonium nitrate and sulfur inside. By late afternoon, port officials recognized the growing danger and ordered a full evacuation of the waterfront. The city's emergency services, already stretched thin, could not mount a coordinated response. At 1:10 a.m. on April 17th, nearly 16 hours after the first explosion, the High Flyer erupted in a second catastrophic blast. The detonation sent a shockwave through the ruined port, toppling what remained of the dockside warehouses and igniting new fires in the oil tank farms. Port Authority records note a final chilling entry. High Flyer exploded. Total destruction. All units withdraw. The High Flyer's delayed explosion underscored how the disaster multiplied itself. Each failure of communication, of infrastructure, of hazard recognition compounded the risk, turning one ship fire into a rolling catastrophe that no single act of heroism or expertise could halt. The port's interconnected design, once a symbol of industrial efficiency, became the pathway by which disaster spread from one vessel to the next, overwhelming every barrier meant to contain it. The shockwave from the Grand Camp's explosion tore through Texas City's critical infrastructure with a force that left little room for recovery. Water mains beneath the port ruptured almost instantly, sending geysers into the street and draining pressure from hydrants across the industrial district. Fire department after-action reports described crews scrambling to connect hoses, only to find them limp and useless. No water, and no way to fight the flames that now swept unchecked through warehouses and refinery yards. As the fires spread, the city's communication network failed in rapid succession. Overhead telephone and telegraph lines snapped under falling debris, severing the main arteries between the port, City Hall, and outside emergency services. Radio dispatchers, cut off from their field units, resorted to runners and battery-powered sets to relay urgent messages. For hours, coordination between fire, police, and mutual aid units was reduced to hand signals and face-to-face orders in the chaos. Inside the refineries, the situation grew desperate. The loss of water pressure crippled fixed foam systems and sprinkler networks designed to protect the most volatile process units. Flames leapt from ruptured gasoline lines, igniting pools of oil and sending black smoke pouring into the sky. Firefighters working with portable pumps scavenged from trucks and tugboats could only defend the perimeters, watching as entire tank farms erupted in secondary blazes. Emergency power generators failed under the strain, plunging control rooms into darkness and silencing the alarms meant to warn of escalating danger. The city's cascading, tightly coupled design, where water, power, and communication lines ran side by side, meant that a single point of failure moved through every layer of response. Each new fire, each broken pipe or fallen pole, multiplied the challenge. The fire department, already devastated by the loss of its men on the docks, found itself outmatched by a disaster that unfolded faster than any plan could adapt. In the aftermath, investigators traced the scale of destruction not just to the force of the initial blast, but to the collapse of the systems meant to contain it. The infrastructure that had fueled Texas City's growth became, in a moment, the pathway for its undoing. Industrial progress still outpaces safety, and chemicals like ammonium nitrate continue to be transported around the world, sometimes with incomplete risk controls. Catastrophe rarely results from a single error. It usually comes from routine choices colliding with overlooked dangers. Today, as ports handle larger volumes and more complex cargo, the gap between operational scale and safety understanding persists. The next disaster will not be unpredictable. It will be unheeded. What risks are we underestimating now? Thanks for watching. Please share your thoughts below.